Captain Kim Tae-ho stood on the bridge of the human ship Harmony's Edge. His hands rested calmly on the command chair as he watched the red planet grow larger on the main screen. This was Vorthak Prime, home to the most feared creatures in the galaxy. The ship moved slowly toward the planet, and Tae-ho could feel the tension in the air around him. Lieutenant Park Min-ho checked his weapon readings for the 5th time in 10 minutes. His fingers shook slightly as he worked. Beside him, Communications Officer Lee Subin kept adjusting her headset even though nothing was wrong with it. Both officers were good soldiers, but today fear was winning over training. The bridge was quiet except for the soft hum of the ship's engines. Everyone spoke in whispers, as if the Vorthak might somehow hear them from space. Tae-ho understood their fear. He had read the same reports they had. He had seen the same videos that made hardened. Warriors wake up screaming. The Vorthak were 12-feet-tall monsters covered in bone spikes. Their claws could cut through steel like paper. Their roar could break reinforced glass and send entire armies running. No one had ever defeated them in battle. Most species in the galaxy considered them to be living nightmares. Commander Han. Ji-won walked up to Tae-ho's chair. She carried a data pad with their mission details. Her face was serious but calm. She was one of the few crew members who seemed in control of her nerves. "Captain, we have 15 minutes until they board our ship," she said quietly. "The Galactic Council's final instructions just came through. We are to avoid any actions that might be seen as threatening. We should not make direct eye contact. We should not move quickly or make loud sounds." Tae-ho nodded as he took the data pad. He read through the warnings again. Do not challenge them. Do not show weakness. Do not show strength. The list of things not to do was longer than the list of things they should do. "What about the other species representatives?" Tae-ho asked. "They are already in the secure meeting room, behind energy shields," Ji-won replied. "The Klaxon ambassador arrived 2 hours ago. He brought 6 bodyguards and requested the strongest force field we have. The Zeridian consul came with a full medical team. They both asked if we have escape pods ready." The other alien species on the ship were much older members of the Galactic Council. They had technology and experience that humans could only dream of. If they were this scared, what chance did a young species like humanity have? Tae-ho looked around the bridge at his crew. These were good people. They had families back on Earth who were counting on them. The mission was important not just for peace, but for humanity's future in the galaxy. If they failed here, humans would remain the newest and least respected members of the Council. "Sir, they are requesting permission to board," Subin announced. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she worked her controls. "Granted," Tae-ho said calmly. The next few minutes felt like hours. The crew waited in silence as the Vorthak ship attached to their docking bay. Through the ship's internal cameras, they could see the docking bay doors opening. Then they heard it. The sound came through the ship's walls like thunder. It was deep and powerful and seemed to shake everything around them. It was the sound of the Vorthak walking. Each step sent vibrations through the metal floors and walls. "Jesus," whispered Engineer Ojiho from his station. "How much do they weigh?" No one answered because they could all hear something else now. Voices. The Vorthak were talking to each other in their own language. It sounded like growling mixed with the roar of wild animals. Even through the walls, the sounds made everyone on the bridge step back from their stations. "Captain," Ji-won said softly, "maybe you should command from the secure room with the other." "Diplomats." Tae-ho shook his head. "A captain meets his guests in person." Medical Officer Dr. Choi Yuna was monitoring everyone's vital signs from her station. "Sir, heart rates are up across the board. Stress hormones are spiking. The crew is moving into panic mode." The sounds were getting closer now. Heavy footsteps in the corridor. The scraping of claws against metal walls. Low rumbling voices that seemed to vibrate in everyone's chest. Lieutenant Min-ho was gripping his control panel so hard his knuckles were white. Captain, the weapon systems are ready if we need them. Stand down all weapons, Tai-Ho ordered firmly. We are here for peace. The bridge doors opened and the Vorthak delegation entered. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The first one through the door was massive even by Vorthak standards. His bone spikes were longer and sharper than the others. Scars covered his arms and chest. This had to be War Master Gorthek, the Bone Crusher. Behind him came 4 other Vorthak, warriors. They moved like hunters, their eyes constantly scanning for threats or weaknesses. Their claws scraped against the floor with each step. Their breathing sounded like the growling of angry beasts. Every human on the bridge moved backward except Tai-Ho. The alien representatives in the secure room were completely silent behind their energy shields. Even their translators had stopped, making noise. Gorthek stopped in the center of the bridge. His massive head turned slowly as he looked at each human crew member. When his eyes met theirs, they looked away immediately, all except Tai-Ho. The War Master's yellow eyes focused on the human captain. For a long moment, neither moved. The bridge was completely silent except for the heavy breathing of the Vorthak and the rapid heartbeats of the humans. Then Gorthek opened his mouth and released his war howl. The sound filled the bridge like a physical force. It was louder than thunder, deeper than any earthly roar. The windows vibrated. The metal walls seemed to bend. Several crew members covered their ears and dropped to their knees. The howl went on for 10 long seconds. When it ended, the silence that followed was even more frightening than the noise had been. Everyone waited to see what Captain Kim Tae-Ho would do next. The war howl echoed through the bridge for what felt like forever. Lieutenant Park Min-ho pressed his hands against his ears, his face twisted in pain. Communications Officer Lee Subin had dropped to one knee behind her console. Even Commander Han Ji-won, who rarely showed fear, had taken several steps backward, but Captain Kim Tae-Ho stood perfectly still. He did not cover his ears. He did not step back. He did not even blink. Instead, he tilted his head slightly to one side, like someone listening to a piece of music they had heard before but could not quite remember. War Master Gorthek's howl slowly died away. The massive Vorthak warrior stared at the human captain with something that might have been confusion. In all his years of battle, no creature had ever stood unmoved when he released his war cry. Even other Vorthak sometimes stepped back from that sound. The bridge was silent except for the heavy breathing of frightened humans and the low rumbling sounds the Vorthak made when they were thinking. Through the security cameras, they could see the other alien diplomats in the meeting room. The Klaxon ambassador was shaking so badly his insect wings were buzzing. The Zeridian consul had turned his crystal body completely dark, which meant he was terrified. Dr. Choi Yuna watched her, medical readings in amazement. While every other human on the ship showed signs of extreme stress, Captain Tai-Ho's heart rate was actually going down. His breathing was becoming slower and deeper. It was as if the presence of the dangerous predators was making him more relaxed, not less. Tai-Ho looked directly into Gorthek's yellow eyes. Most creatures could not hold a Vorthak's gaze for more than a few seconds. The predators used their stare to establish dominance over other beings. But Tai-Ho met the War Master's eyes calmly and held them there. Then something incredible happened. Tai-Ho opened his mouth and made a sound. It was not a human sound. It was deep and low, coming from somewhere in his chest. It was almost like a growl, but softer. It had rhythm to it, like a song without words. The sound went on for several seconds, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed familiar, even though none of the humans had heard it before. The Vorthak warriors all stopped moving. Their heads turned toward Tae-Ho with sudden interest. One of them, a female with silver-tipped spines, made a small rumbling sound that might have been surprise. Gorthek's bone spikes, which had been standing straight up in aggressive display, slowly began to lower. His massive hands, which had been clenched into fists, relaxed slightly. He tilted his own head and made a responding sound, deeper than Tae-Ho's, but with a similar rhythm. Lieutenant Minho whispered to Engineer Jiho, "What is happening? Is the captain speaking their language?" "I do not think so," Jiho whispered back. "The translation computers are not picking up any words. It is something else." Taeho made another sound, longer this time. It had different tones in it, almost like he was asking a question. Gorthek's response was immediate and seemed pleased. The huge warrior took a step closer to the human captain, but it was not a threatening step. It was curious. Commander Ji-won was recording everything on her personal device. She had never seen anything like this in all her years of military service. The most feared predators in the galaxy were having what looked like a conversation with her captain, and neither side was using actual words. The other Vorthak warriors began to relax as well. Their claws retracted slightly. Their breathing became less aggressive. One of them, a young male with bright red spines, made a soft rumbling sound that almost sounded like laughter. Through the communication system, they could hear the alien diplomats talking in panicked voices. The Klaxon ambassador was demanding to know what was happening. The Zeridian consul was asking if the humans had some kind of secret weapon that could control Vorthak minds. But on the bridge, something much simpler was taking place. Taeho and Gorthek were beginning to understand each other in a way that had nothing to do with words or weapons or technology. Taeho made a series of shorter sounds, each one different from the last. Gorthek listened carefully, then responded, with his own series of sounds. It was like watching two musicians play together, each one building on what the other had created. Dr. Yuna was studying her readings more carefully now. "Commander Ji-won," she said quietly, "the captain's brain activity is very unusual. He is using parts of his mind that normally only activate during deep meditation or when people are remembering very old memories." "What kind of memories?" Ji-won asked. "I am not sure, but they seem to be from childhood, very early childhood." The conversation between Taeho and Gorthek was becoming more complex. The War Master would make a sound, and Taeho would respond not just with his voice, but with subtle changes in his posture. He would straighten his shoulders or tilt his head or shift his weight from one foot to the other. Each movement seemed to have meaning. The most amazing thing was that Gorthek was responding to these movements. When Taeho straightened his shoulders, the War Master's spines lowered further. When Taeho tilted his head, Gorthek made a softer sound. It was like they were speaking a language made up of sounds and movements that somehow both of them understood. Communications Officer Subin was working, frantically at her station, trying to record and analyze everything. "Sir," she called to Commander Ji-won, "the translation computers cannot make sense of any of this, but there are patterns in the sounds, mathematical patterns, like they are following rules we do not know." The female Vorthak with silver spines stepped closer to Taeho. She made a sound that was much gentler than anything they had heard from her species before. Taeho responded with an equally gentle sound, and she seemed pleased. Lieutenant Minho was no longer afraid. He was fascinated. How does he know how to do this? We studied everything about the Vorthak before this mission. There was nothing in any of the reports about this kind of communication. Engineer Jiho shook his head in wonder. Maybe the reports were wrong. Maybe no one ever tried to talk to them like this before. The bridge had become a place of quiet amazement instead of terror. The crew watched as their captain continued his strange conversation with the galaxy's most feared predators. Whatever was happening, it was working. For the first time in recorded history, Vorthak warriors were relaxed in the presence of other species. And somehow, Captain Kim Taeho had made it happen with nothing more than sounds and movements that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his memory. The question now was what would happen next. The conversation between Captain Taeho and War Master Gorthek continued for another hour. The Vorthak warriors had settled into comfortable positions around the bridge. no longer looking like they were ready for battle. The human crew watched, in amazement, as their captain somehow kept pace with creatures that had terrified the galaxy for centuries. But Taiho's mind was not entirely in the present moment. As he made the deep rumbling sounds that the Vorthak seemed to understand, memories from his childhood began to surface. Clear, vivid memories he had not thought about in years. He remembered being 6 years old on the colony world of New Busan. His parents, Dr. Kim Sang-woo and Dr. Kim Yoon-ji, were conservation biologists who worked in the wilderness preserve. The preserve was where Earth had relocated its most dangerous predators during the terraforming process. It was supposed to be a safe place where the great hunters of Earth could live without threatening the human colonists. Most children were not allowed anywhere near the preserve, but Taiho's parents lived right on the edge of it, in a research station surrounded by energy fences and warning signs. They studied the relocated predators, trying to understand how they were adapting to their new world. That was where Taiho had met Baek. The Siberian tiger had been brought to the preserve as an orphaned cub. His mother had been killed by poachers on Earth just before the relocation program began. He was too young to survive on his own, so Dr. Kim Sang-woo had taken him into the research station to care for him. Taiho remembered the first time he saw the tiger cub. Baek was small then, no bigger than a large dog, but even as a baby he had the eyes of a predator. Yellow eyes that seemed to look right through you and see everything you were thinking. Most people were afraid of those eyes, even when they belonged to a cub. But 6-year-old Taiho had looked into them and felt something different. Not fear, but recognition. Like meeting someone he had always known but never met. Dr. Yoon-ji had been worried about letting her son near the tiger, even a young one. Tigers were apex predators, built by evolution to hunt and kill. Their instincts were older and stronger than any training humans could give them, but Dr. Sang-woo had noticed something unusual. When Taiho was around, Baek was calmer. The cub would stop pacing in his enclosure and settle down. He would make soft rumbling sounds that the adult tigers used to communicate contentment and safety. As the months passed, Taiho and Baek became inseparable. The boy would sit by the tiger's enclosure for hours, and they would communicate in ways that had nothing to do with human language. Taiho learned to read Baek's body language, to understand what different sounds meant, to know when the tiger was happy or sad or excited. More importantly, he learned how to respond. When Baek made a low, rumbling sound, Taiho would make a similar sound back. When the tiger showed his teeth in what looked like aggression but was actually play, Taiho would bare his own teeth in response. They developed their own language made up of sounds and movements and expressions that only they understood. Dr. Sang-woo documented everything. He had never seen anything like the bond between his son and the tiger. In his research notes, he wrote that Taiho seemed to have an instinctive understanding of predator communication. The boy was learning to speak. Tiger the way other children learn to speak human languages. As Baek grew larger and stronger, some people thought he should be moved to a more secure facility. Adult tigers were dangerous, they said. Even one raised by humans could turn on them without warning. It was not safe to have a growing tiger so close to a human child. But Taiho's parents had seen something that others missed. Baek was not just tolerating the boy's presence. He was protecting him. When strangers came to the research station, the tiger would position himself between them and Taiho. When other predators in the preserve made threatening sounds, Baek would answer with warnings of his own. The tiger had accepted Taiho as part of his pack, and Taiho had learned to be worthy of that acceptance. The boy learned that predators did not respect weakness, but they did not respect false strength either. They could sense fear and uncertainty from great distances, but they could also sense genuine confidence and calm. Taiho learned to approach Baek without fear, not because he was not dangerous, but because he trusted their bond. By the time Taiho was 10 years old, Baek was fully grown. He weighed over 400 pounds, and could break a man's neck with one swipe of his paw. But when Tai-Ho sat beside him, the massive tiger would purr like a house cat. The rumbling sound would vibrate through the boy's chest, and Tai-Ho would rumble back in the same rhythm. The colonial authorities finally decided that Beck had to be moved to a maximum security facility. They arrived one morning with tranquilizer guns and transport cages, ready to take the tiger away from the only home he had known. 10-year-old Tai-Ho had stood between Bayek and the armed officials. He made the same protective rumbling sound he had learned from the tiger, and Bayek stood beside him, both of them facing down a dozen adults who suddenly realized they were dealing with more than just a boy and his pet. The standoff lasted for hours. Tai-Ho's parents eventually negotiated a compromise that let Bayek stay in an expanded enclosure at the research station. But the incident taught everyone involved something important about the bond between predator and friend. Now, 20 years later, Captain Tai-Ho was using those same lessons to communicate with the Vorthak. The sounds he made, the way he held his body, the calm confidence he projected, all of it came from a childhood spent learning to be worthy of a tiger's trust. War Master Gorthek seemed to sense this. The massive predator was responding to Tai-Ho not as prey or enemy, but as someone who understood what it meant to be part of a pack with apex hunters. For the first time since the negotiations began, there was real hope for peace. Engineer Jiho was the first to understand what was really happening. He had been recording the entire exchange between Captain Tai-Ho and the Vorthak warriors, running the audio through every analysis program the ship had. What he discovered changed everything they thought they knew about communication. "Commander Jiwon," he called quietly from his station. "You need to see this." Jiwon moved carefully across the bridge, trying not to disturb the ongoing conversation between Tai-Ho and Gorthek. The War Master was making a series of complex sounds while moving his massive hands in specific patterns. Tai-Ho was following along, responding with his own sounds and gestures. Jiho showed her his screen. "Look at these patterns. The captain is not just copying their sounds. He is participating in some kind of ritual. The computer has identified 17 different sound categories, and each one triggers a specific physical response from the Vorthak linguist." Namhieri had joined them at Jiho's station. Her expertise in alien languages had made her invaluable on previous missions, but the Vorthak had always been considered impossible to communicate with. Now she was seeing something that challenged everything she thought she knew about language. "This is not language as we understand it," she whispered. "This is something much older, much more basic. It is like watching two animals establish pack hierarchy, but with intelligence and intention behind it." On the bridge, Tai-Ho was facing a new challenge from Gorthek. The War Master had risen to his full 12-foot height and was making aggressive postures. His bone spikes were rising, his claws were extending, and he was making sounds that seemed designed to intimidate. But instead of backing down or responding with aggression of his own, Tai-Ho did something unexpected. He lowered his head slightly, not in submission but in acknowledgement. Then he made a sound that was deep and respectful, followed by a gesture that seemed to say, "I understand your strength." Gorthek's response was immediate and dramatic. His spikes lowered, his posture relaxed, and he made a sound that could only be described as pleased approval. "Did you see that?" Dr. Choi Yuna said from her medical station. The War Master was testing him, and the captain passed the test. Namhieri was working frantically to decode what she was seeing. "I think I understand now. This is not about words or grammar. This is about proving worthiness. The Vorthak are seeing if Captain Tai-Ho is someone they can respect." The female Vorthak with silver spines stepped forward. She began making sounds that were different from Gorthek's, softer but no less complex. Tai-Ho listened carefully, then responded with sounds that matched her tone and rhythm. "She is telling him something important," Hieri said, watching the exchange. Look at how the other Vortak are reacting. They are all paying attention. Through the ship's translation system, they could hear the alien diplomats in the secure room. The Klaxon ambassador was demanding explanations. The Zeridian consul was insisting that this had to be some kind of human trick or technology. But Lieutenant Park Minho was beginning to understand that it was neither trick nor technology. "Commander," he said to Jiwan, "I think the captain grew up with predators. Look at how comfortable he is with them. This is not something you can learn from books." Jiwan nodded slowly. She had served with Taeho for 3 years, but he had never talked much about his childhood. She was beginning to realize there were things about her captain that she had never suspected. On the bridge, the conversation was becoming more intense. Taeho and Gorthek were making longer, more complex sounds. The other Vorthak warriors were participating now, adding their own voices to what was becoming a kind of group discussion. "They are sharing stories," Namhieri said with sudden understanding. "Look at the patterns. One person tells something, others respond, then they build on each other's contributions. It is like a verbal tradition, but with sounds instead of words." Communications Officer Lee Subin was recording everything while trying to maintain contact with the other ships in their convoy. "Commander, the escort vessels are asking what is happening. They can hear the Vorthak sounds through our communication system, and their crews are getting nervous." "Tell them to maintain position and stay calm," Jiwan ordered. "Whatever is happening here, it seems to be working." Taeho had begun sharing something with the Vorthak that was making them all lean in closer. His sounds were softer now, more personal. He was using gestures that seemed to describe size and shape, and his voice had the tone of someone talking about something they loved very much. Dr. Yuna was monitoring not just the humans now, but also the Vorthak. The ship's sensors were picking up their vital signs, and what she saw was remarkable. "Commander, the Vorthak stress indicators are dropping. Their heart rates are slowing down. They are becoming genuinely relaxed." The young male Vorthak with red spines made a sound that was unmistakably curious. He was asking Taeho a question, and the captain was answering by making sounds that seemed to describe movement and playfulness. "I think he is telling them about someone he knew," Jiho said, studying his recordings. "Someone important to him. The patterns suggest he is describing a relationship, a friendship." Gorthek made a sound that was deeper and more serious than anything they had heard before. The other Vorthak all became quiet and attentive. This was clearly something significant. Taeho listened carefully, then responded with sounds that were equally serious and respectful. But there was something else in his voice now. Understanding and sympathy. "They are connecting," Namhieri said with amazement. After centuries of being unable to communicate with the Vorthak, a human captain is actually having a meaningful conversation with them. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes. Sometimes it was serious. Sometimes it seemed almost playful. The Vorthak warriors were showing sides of themselves that no other species had ever seen. They were not just predators or warriors. They were intelligent beings with their own stories and emotions. Finally, Gorthek made a sound that seemed to indicate the formal part of their meeting was over. He looked directly at Taeho and made a gesture that was clearly an invitation. Taeho nodded and made a responding sound that accepted the invitation. "What just happened?" Jiwon asked quietly. Namhieri was staring at her analysis screens in wonder. "I think they just agreed to talk more, but not here. Gortek is inviting the captain to continue their conversation somewhere else. For the first time since the Vorthak had boarded their ship, the bridge crew felt hope instead of fear. Their captain had done something that every expert said was impossible. He had found a way to communicate with the galaxy's most feared predators. The question now was what they would talk about next. The meeting moved to the ship's main conference room, where the energy shields had been turned off for the first time since the Vorthak arrived. The alien diplomats had reluctantly agreed to participate without barriers, though they stayed as far from the predators as possible. Captain Taiho sat across from War Master Gorthek at the large table. The other Vorthak warriors arranged themselves around the room in positions that seemed both protective and relaxed. Commander Jiwon and her team took notes, while Namhyeri continued trying to decode the complex communication taking place. What happened next surprised everyone. Gorthek began to tell his own story, using the same mixture of sounds and gestures that Taiho had used earlier. But this story was different. It was not about friendship and play. It was about isolation and misunderstanding. Through careful listening and analysis, the human crew began to piece together what the War Master was sharing. The Vorthak had not chosen to be the galaxy's feared predators. They had been forced into that role by centuries of other species attacking them first. Every time we tried to make contact with new species, Gorthek's sounds seemed to say, they saw only our size and our claws and our teeth. They decided we were monsters before they ever tried to talk to us. The female Vorthak with silver spines added her own part to the story. Her sounds described battles that the Vorthak had not wanted to fight, but had been forced into when other species tried to claim their territory or eliminate them as threats. We became what they said we were, her gestures seemed to indicate. If they wanted monsters, we gave them monsters. It was easier than trying to prove we were something else. Dr. Yuna was monitoring the emotional indicators of both species during this exchange. Commander, she reported quietly to Jiwon. The Vorthak are showing genuine sadness and frustration. This is not an act or a manipulation. They really have been misunderstood. Taiho listened to each part of the story with the same careful attention. He had learned to give back all those years ago. When the Vorthak finished, he responded by sharing more of his own memories. He told them about growing up with a creature that everyone else feared, but who had been his closest friend. He described the lessons Beck had taught him about trust and respect and the bonds that could exist between different species if both sides were willing to try. The young red-spined Vorthak made sounds that seemed to ask about specific details. How had the tiger and the human boy learned to communicate? How had they built trust when every instinct should have told them to be afraid of each other? Taiho's answer was simple but profound. He made sounds and gestures that described patience, consistency, and mutual respect. He showed them how he had learned to approach Bayek without fear, not because the tiger was not dangerous, but because he understood that the danger was not directed at him. You acknowledge the strength without challenging it, his gestures seemed to say. You show respect without showing weakness. You prove you are worthy to be trusted. Gorthek's response was immediate and emotional. The massive predator made sounds that could only be described as relieved gratitude. For the first time in his long life, someone understood what the Vorthak had been trying to communicate through their actions. We are not monsters, his sounds seemed to say. We are warriors. There is a difference. Warriors can choose when to fight and when to make peace. Monsters cannot choose anything. The Klaxon ambassador finally found the courage to speak. Through his translator, he asked, if the Vorthak are not monsters, why have they never tried to make peace before? Gorthek turned his attention to the insect diplomat. His sounds were patient but firm as he explained that they had tried many times over the centuries. But every attempt at peaceful contact had ended the same way, with the other species either running away in terror or attacking them in panic. You see our claws and decide we will use them on you, the War Master's gestures indicated. You hear our voices and decide we are threatening you. You judge us by our appearance and never try to understand our intentions. The Zeridian consul's crystal body flickered with different colors as he processed this information. But your reputation across the galaxy, the stories of Vorthak aggression, the silver-spined female answered this with sounds that carried both sadness and anger. Every story of Vorthak aggression began with someone else attacking us first. We defend ourselves, and somehow we become the villains. Taiho was beginning to see the full tragedy of the situation. The Vorthak had been trapped in a cycle of fear and violence that they had not created but could not escape. Every attempt at peace had failed because other species could not get past their terror long enough to listen. "But you listened to us," Gorthek's sound seemed to say to Taiho. "You stood still when we tried to frighten you. You answered our challenge with respect instead of fear or anger. Why?" Taiho's answer came from his deepest memories. He made the same rumbling sound that Beck used to make when he was content and safe. It was a sound of friendship and trust that crossed all species barriers. "Because I learned long ago that the most dangerous friends are often the most loyal," his gestures seemed to indicate. "And the strongest protectors are those who choose to protect rather than harm." The room fell silent as both species absorbed what had been shared. The human crew was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something historic, not just first contact with the Vorthak, but the first real communication between the predator species and the rest of the galaxy. Lieutenant Minho spoke quietly to Engineer Jiho. "Do you think this could really work? Could we actually make peace with them?" Before Jiho could answer, Gorthek made a sound that was different from anything they had heard before. It was formal and ceremonial, with undertones that suggested great significance. Namhieri worked frantically with her translation equipment. I think he is making some kind of formal declaration," she whispered. The War Master stood to his full height and looked directly at Captain Taiho. His voice filled the room as he made a series of sounds that were clearly important. The other Vorthak all responded with their own sounds, creating a chorus that was both beautiful and powerful. When the ceremony ended, Gorthek approached Taiho and made a gesture that seemed to indicate respect and friendship. Then he spoke a single word in clear, understandable human language, "Brother." The word hung in the air like a promise. For the first time in galactic history, a Vorthak War Master had claimed kinship with a member of another species. Captain Kim Taiho smiled and responded with the same word in the Vorthak language, using the deep rumbling sounds he had learned so long ago from a tiger named Beck. "Brother." 3 days later, the signing ceremony took place aboard the Vorthak flagship, a massive warship called the Bone Render. Captain Taiho and his crew were the first non-Vorthak beings ever allowed on board one of their vessels. The honor was not lost on anyone present. The ship's interior was unlike anything the humans had seen before. The walls were decorated with carvings that told the story of Vorthak history through images rather than words. Scenes of great hunts, epic battles, and legendary warriors covered every surface. But there were also quieter images. Vorthak, families, celebrations, and moments of peace that no other species had ever known existed. Commander Jiwan walked beside Taiho as they moved through the corridors. "Sir, the Galactic Council is still trying to understand what happened. 3 species are requesting immediate meetings with humanity to learn how we accomplished this." "And what did you tell them?" Taiho asked. "The truth. That sometimes the best diplomats are those who learned to make friends with dangerous creatures when they were children." The main ceremony hall was enormous, built to accommodate beings of Vorthak size. War Master Gorthek stood at the center, wearing ceremonial armor decorated with silver and gold. Around him were gathered the leaders of 12 Vorthak clans, representing their entire species. The other galactic diplomats were present as well, though they seemed much smaller and less important in this setting. The Klaxon ambassador had brought gifts of rare metals. The Zeridian consul had offered technological exchanges, but everyone understood that this was really about the bond between humans and Vorthak. Dr. Choi Yuna had spent the last 3 days studying Vorthak biology and culture. "Captain," she said quietly, "what they are offering us is unprecedented. Full military alliance, shared technology, and something they call pack bonds. I am not sure the galaxy is ready for humans backed by Vorthak warriors. The ceremony began with traditional Vorthak rituals that had never been witnessed by outsiders. The clan leaders told stories of their greatest heroes, using the same combination of sounds and gestures that Taiho had learned to understand. Each story ended with a challenge to the new allies. Would humans prove worthy of Vorthak friendship? Taiho responded to each challenge in the same way he had learned to respond to Bayek's tests of trust. With respect, confidence, and the quiet strength that came from understanding what it meant to be part of a predator's pack. When the formal ceremonies ended, Gorthek approached Taiho with something in his massive hands. It was a collar made from polished bone and silver, carved with symbols that seemed to tell a story. "This belonged to my bond brother," the War Master said in carefully pronounced human words. "He died in battle 3 seasons ago. I give it to you so you will remember that bonds between hunters are stronger than blood." Taiho accepted the collar with both hands, understanding the enormous honor he was being given. In Vorthak culture, bond brothers were closer than family. They were chosen companions who had proven themselves worthy of absolute trust. "I will wear it with honor," Taiho replied in the Vorthak language, his sounds carrying the same depth of meaning that Gorthek's had. The signing of the alliance documents was almost anticlimactic after the emotional ceremony. But the legal implications were staggering. Humanity had just gained the most powerful military ally in the galaxy. The Vorthak had finally found a species that saw them as partners rather than threats. Lieutenant Minho was recording everything for the historical archives. "Sir, Command is asking about the military implications of this alliance. How do we explain to Earth that we have just made friends with the galaxy's apex predators?" "We tell them the truth," Taiho said. "We tell them that sometimes the strongest friendships are built on mutual respect rather than mutual fear." As the ceremonies concluded, the female Vorthak with silver spines approached Taiho. She had been quiet during most of the formal proceedings, but now she had something important to say. "Your tiger friend," she said in halting human words. "Tell me about him again." Taiho smiled and began to describe Bayek once more, using both human words and Vorthak sounds. He told her about the tiger's strength and loyalty, about the games they played and the trust they shared, about the day Bayek stood beside him to face down armed adults. The female listened intently, then made a sound that Taiho now recognized as deep approval. "Good bond," she said. "Strong friendship. You learned well from your pack brother." Engineer Ojiho was working with Vorthak technicians to establish permanent communication protocols between the two species. "Captain, they want to exchange technical information immediately. Their ship computers can interface with ours, and they are offering to share navigation data for unexplored sectors." "And what do they want in return?" Commander Jiwon asked. "Stories," Jiho said with amazement. "They want to hear more stories about Earth animals and human friendships with dangerous creatures. They find it fascinating that humans can form bonds with predators." The young red-spined Vorthak had become particularly interested in human culture. He approached Taiho with a tablet displaying images of Earth animals. "More like your tiger?" he asked eagerly. Taiho laughed and began showing him pictures of lions, wolves, bears, and other predators that humans had learned to understand and respect. Each image sparked excited discussions among the Vorthak warriors. "We thought you were the only species brave enough to live with hunters," the young warrior said. "But your whole planet is full of predators, and you learned to share space with all of them." As the celebration continued, Communications Officer Lee Subin received a priority message from Earth Command. She brought it to Taiho with wide eyes. "Sir, 3 more species have requested formal diplomatic meetings with humanity. They want to know if we can help them communicate with other difficult species they have been unable to reach. Taiho looked around the celebration, watching humans, and Vorthak sharing stories and laughter. The bond that had started with a small boy and a tiger cub had somehow grown into something that might change the entire galaxy. "Tell Earth Command that we will be happy to help," he said. "But first, we need to learn more Vorthak words. I think our new friends have a lot more stories to tell us." War Master Gorthek overheard this and made the rumbling sound that Taiho now knew was Vorthak laughter. "Many stories," the huge predator agreed, "and now, finally, someone to tell them to." As the celebration continued late into the night, Captain Kim Taiho stood looking out at the stars and thinking about an old friend named Baek. The tiger had taught him that the most dangerous creatures could also be the most loyal friends. Now, that lesson was helping to build bridges across the galaxy. The man who had stood unshaken by the predators, Howl, had indeed grown up with one as a companion, and that childhood friendship had somehow become the foundation for peace between species that had been enemies for centuries. In the end, it was not weapons or technology or clever diplomacy that had made the difference. It was simply the understanding that friendship and respect could exist between any creatures willing to trust each other. The galaxy would never be the same,